Chapter 2. The squad of police made their way back to the station. They walked raggedly with rifles slung anyhow, ends of cotton where buttons should have been, a putty slipping down over the ankle, small men with black secret Indian eyes. The small plaza on the hilltop was lighted with globes strung together in threes and joined by trailing overhead wires. The treasury, the presidencia, a dentist's, the prison, a low white colonnaded building which dated back 300 years, and then the steep street down the back wall of a ruined church. Whichever way you went you came ultimately to water and to river. Pink classical facades peeled off and showed the mud beneath, and the mud slowly reverted to mud. Round the plaza the evening parade went on, women in one direction, men in the other. Young men in red shirts milled boisterously round the gaseosa stalls. The lieutenant walked in front of his men with an air of bitter distaste. He might have been chained to them unwillingly. Perhaps the scar on his jaw was the relic of an escape. His gaiters were polished, and his pistol holster, his buttons were all sewn on. He had a sharp, crooked nose jutting out of a lean dancer's face. His neatness gave an effect of inordinate ambition in the shabby city. A sour smell came up to the plaza from the 16 River, and the vultures were bedded on the roofs, under the tent of their rough black wings. Sometimes a little moron head peered out and down and a claw shifted. At 9:30 exactly, all the lights in the plaza went out. A policeman clumsily presented arms and the squad marched into barracks. They waited for no order, hanging up their rifles by the officers' room, lurching on into the courtyard, to their hammocks, or the excusado. Some of them kicked off their boots and lay down. Plaster was peeling off the mud walls. A generation of policemen had scrawled messages on the whitewash. A few peasants waited on a bench, hands between their knees. Nobody paid them any attention. 2 men were fighting in the lavatory. "Where is the chief?" the lieutenant asked. No one knew. They thought he was playing billiards somewhere in the town. The lieutenant sat down with dapper irritation at the chief's table. Behind his head 2 hearts were entwined in pencil on the whitewash. "All right," he said. "What are you waiting for?" "Bring me the prisoners." They came in bowing, hat in hand, one behind the other. "So and so. Drunk and disorderly. Fined 5 pesos. But I can't pay, Your Excellency. Let him clean out the lavatory and the cells then. So and so. Defaced an election poster. Fined 5 pesos. So and so. Found wearing a holy medal under his shirt. Fined 5 pesos. The duty drew to a close. There was nothing of importance. Through the open door the mosquitoes came whirring in. Outside, the sentry could be heard presenting arms. It was the chief of police. He came breezily in, a stout man with a pink fat face, dressed in white flannels with a wide-awake hat and a cartridge belt and a big pistol dapping his thigh. He held a handkerchief to his mouth. He was in distress. "Toothache again," he said, "toothache." "Nothing to report," the lieutenant said with contempt. "The governor was at me again today," the chief complained. "Liquor?" "No, a priest. The last was shot weeks ago." "He doesn't think so." "The devil of it is," the lieutenant said, "we haven't 17 photographs." He glanced along the wall to the picture of James Calver, wanted in the United States for bank robbery and homicide, a tough uneven face taken at 2 angles, description circulated to every station in Central America, the low forehead and the fanatic bent on one thing eyes. He looked at it with regret. There was so little chance that he would ever get south. He would be picked up in some dive at the border in Juarez or Piedras Negras or Nogales. "He says we have," the chief complained. "My tooth, oh, my tooth. He tried to find something in his hip pocket, but the holster got in the way. The lieutenant tapped his polished boot impatiently. There, the chief said. A large number of people sat round a table, young girls in white muslin, older women with untidy hair and harassed expressions. A few men peered shyly and solicitously out of the background. All the faces were made up of small dots. It was a newspaper photograph of a First Communion party taken years ago. A youngish man in a Roman collar sat among the women. You could imagine him petted with small delicacies, preserved for their use in the stifling atmosphere of intimacy and respect. He sat there, plump, with protuberant eyes, bubbling with harmless feminine jokes. It was taken years ago. He looks like all the rest, the lieutenant said. It was obscure, but you could read into the smudgy photograph a well-shaved, well-powdered jowl much too developed for his age. The good things of life had come to him too early: the respect of his contemporaries, a safe livelihood, the trite religious word upon the tongue, the joke to ease the way, the ready acceptance of other people's homage, a happy man. A natural hatred as between dog and dog stirred in the lieutenant's bowels. We've shot him half a dozen times, he said. The governor has had a report. He tried to get away last week to Veracruz. What are the red shirts doing that he comes to us? Oh, they missed him, of course. It was just luck that he didn't catch the boat. What happened to him? They found his mule. The governor says he must have him this month, before the rains come. 18. Where was his parish? Concepcion and the villages round. But he left there years ago. Is anything known? He can pass as a gringo. He spent 6 years at some American seminary. I don't know what else. He was born in Carmen, the son of a storekeeper. Not that that helps. They all look alike to me, the lieutenant said. Something you could almost have called horror moved him when he looked at the white muslin dresses. He remembered the smell of incense in the churches of his boyhood, the candles and the laciness and the self-esteem, the immense demands made from the altar steps by men who didn't know the meaning of sacrifice. The old peasants knelt there before the holy images with their arms held out in the attitude of the cross. Tired by the long day's labor in the plantations, they squeezed out a further mortification. And the priest came round with the collecting bag, taking their centavos, abusing them for their small comforting sins, and sacrificing nothing at all in return except a little sexual indulgence. And that was easy, the lieutenant thought. He himself felt no need of women. He said, "We will catch him. It is only a question of time." My tooth, the chief wailed again. He said, "It poisons the whole of life. Today my biggest break was 25. You will have to change your dentist. They are all the same." The lieutenant took the photograph and pinned it on the wall. James Calver, bank robber and homicide, stared in harsh profile towards the First Communion party. "He is a man at any rate," the lieutenant said, with approval. "Who?" "The gringo." The chief said, "You heard what he did in Houston. Got away with $10,000. 2 seamen were shot. G-men. It's an honor in a way to deal with such people." He slapped furiously out at a mosquito. "A man like that," the lieutenant said, "does no real harm. A few men dead. We all have to die. The money, somebody has to spend it. We do more good when we catch one of 19 these." He had the dignity of an idea, standing in the little whitewashed room in his polished boots and his venom. There was something disinterested in his ambition, a kind of virtue in his desire to catch the sleek, respected guest of the First Communion party. The chief said mournfully, "He must be devilishly cunning if he's been going on for years." "Anybody could do it," the lieutenant said. "We haven't really troubled about them unless they put themselves in our hands. Why, I could guarantee to fetch this man inside a month if what? If I had the power." "It's easy to talk," the chief said. "What would you do? This is a small state. Mountains on the north, the sea on the south. I'd beat it as you beat a street, house by house." "Oh, it sounds easy," the chief wailed indistinctly with his handkerchief against his mouth. The lieutenant said suddenly, "I will tell you what I'd do. I would take a man from every village in the state as a hostage. If the villagers didn't report the man when he came, the hostages would be shot and then we'd take more. A lot of them would die, of course." "Wouldn't it be worth it?" the lieutenant said with a kind of exultation. "To be rid of those people forever. You know," the chief said, "you've got something there." The lieutenant walked home through the shuttered town. All his life had lain here. The syndicate of workers and peasants had once been a school. He had helped to wipe out that unhappy memory. The whole town was changed. The cement playground up the hill near the cemetery where iron swings stood like gallows in the moony darkness was the site of the cathedral. The new children would have new memories. Nothing would ever be as it was. There was something of a priest in his intent observant walk, a theologian going back over the errors of the past to destroy them again. He reached his own lodging. The houses were all one-storied, whitewashed, built round small patios, with a well and a few flowers. The windows on the street were barred. Inside the lieutenant's room there was a bed made of old packing cases with a straw mat laid on top, a cushion, and a sheet. There was a picture of the president on the wall, a calendar, and on the tiled floor a table and a rocking chair. In the light of a candle it looked as comfortless as a prison or a monastic cell. The lieutenant sat down upon his bed and began to take off his boots. It was the hour of prayer. Black beetles exploded against the walls like crackers. More than a dozen crawled over the tiles with injured wings. It infuriated him to think that there were still people in the state who believed in a loving and merciful God. There are mystics who are said to have experienced God directly. He was a mystic, too, and what he had experienced was vacancy, a complete certainty in the existence of a dying, cooling world, of human beings who had evolved from animals for no purpose at all. He knew. He lay down in his shirt and breeches on the bed and blew out the candle. He'd stood in the room like an enemy. But he believed against the evidence of his senses in the cold, empty ether spaces. A radio was playing somewhere, music from Mexico City, or perhaps even from London or New York, filtered into this obscure, neglected state. It seemed to him like a weakness. This was his own land, and he would have walled it in with steel if he could, until he had eradicated from it everything which reminded him of how it had once appeared to a miserable child. He wanted to destroy everything, to be alone without any memories at all. Life began 5 years ago. The lieutenant lay on his back with his eyes open while the beetles detonated on the ceiling. He remembered the priest the red shirts had shot against the wall of the cemetery up the hill, another little fat man with popping eyes. He was a Monsignor, and he thought that would protect him. He had a sort of contempt for the lower clergy, and right up to the last he was explaining his rank. Only at the very end had he remembered his prayers. He knelt down and they had given him time for a short act of contrition. The lieutenant had watched. He wasn't directly concerned. Altogether they had shot about 5 priests. 2 or 3 had escaped. The bishop was safely in Mexico City, and one man had conformed to the governor's law that all priests must marry. He lived now near the river with his housekeeper. That, of course, was the best solution of all, to 21 leave the living witness to the weakness of their faith. It showed the deception they had practiced all these years. For if they really believed in heaven or hell, they wouldn't mind a little pain now, in return for what immensities. The lieutenant, lying on his hard bed, in the damp hot dark, felt no sympathy at all with the weakness of the flesh. In the back room of the Academia Commercial a woman was reading to her family. 2 small girls of 6 and 10 sat on the edge of their bed, and a boy of 14 leaned against the wall with an expression of intense weariness. Young Juan, the mother read, from his earliest years was noted for his humility and piety. Other boys might be rough and revengeful. Young Juan followed the precept of our Lord and turned the other cheek. One day his father thought that he had told a lie and beat him. Later he learned that his son had told the truth, and he apologized to Juan. But Juan said to him, "Dear father, just as our Father in heaven has the right to chastise when he pleases." The boy rubbed his face impatiently against the whitewash and the mild voice droned on. The 2 little girls sat with beady intense eyes, drinking in the sweet piety. We must not think that young Juan did not laugh and play like other children, though there were times when he would creep away with a holy picture book to his father's cowhouse from the circle of his merry playmates. The boy squashed a beetle with his bare foot and thought gloomily that after all everything had an end. Someday they would reach the last chapter and young Juan would die against a wall, shouting, "Viva el Cristo Rey." But then, he supposed, there would be another book. They were smuggled in every month from Mexico City. If only the customs men had known where to look. No, young Juan was a true young Mexican boy, and if he was more thoughtful than his fellows, he was also always the first when any play acting was afoot. One year his class acted a little play before the bishop, based on the persecution of the early Christians, and no one was more amused than Juan when he was chosen to play the part of Nero. And what comic spirit he put into his acting, this child, whose young manhood was 22, to be cut short by a ruler far worse than Nero. His classmate, who later became Father Miguel Serra, S.J., writes, "None of us who were there will ever forget that day. One of the little girls licked her lips secretively. This was life." The curtain rose on Juan wearing his mother's best bathrobe, a charcoal mustache, and a crown made from a tin biscuit box. Even the good old bishop smiled when Juan strode to the front of the little homemade stage and began to declaim. The boy strangled a yawn against the whitewashed wall. He said wearily, "Is he really a saint? He will be one day soon, when the Holy Father pleases." And are they all like that? Who? The martyrs. Yes. All. Even Padre Jose. "Don't mention him," the mother said. "How dare you? That despicable man. A traitor to God. He told me he was more of a martyr than the rest. I've told you many times not to speak to him. My dear child, oh, my dear child. And the other one, the one who came to see us? No, he is not exactly like Juan. Is he despicable? No, no. Not despicable." The smallest girl said suddenly, "He smelled funny." The mother went on reading. Did any premonition touch young Juan that night that he, too, in a few short years, would be numbered among the martyrs? We cannot say, but Father Miguel Serra tells how that evening Juan spent longer than usual upon his knees, and when his classmates teased him a little, as boys will. The voice went on and on, mild and deliberate, inflexibly gentle. The small girls listened intently, framing in their minds little pious sentences with which to surprise their parents, and the boy yawned against the whitewash. Everything has an end. Presently the mother went in to her husband. She said, I am so worried about the boy. Why not about the girls? There is worry everywhere. 23 They are two little saints already. But the boy, he asks such questions about that whiskey priest. I wish we had never had him in the house. They would have caught him if we hadn't, and then he would have been one of your martyrs. They would write a book about him and you would read it to the children. That man never. Well, after all, her husband said, he carries on. I don't believe all that they write in these books. We are all human. You know what I heard today? About a poor woman who took her son to be baptized. She wanted him called Pedro, but he was so drunk that he took no notice at all and baptized the boy Carlotta. Carlotta. Well, it's a good saint's name. There are times, the mother said, when I lose all patience with you. And now the boy has been talking to Padre Jose. This is a small town, her husband said. And there is no use pretending. We have been abandoned here. We must get along as best we can. As for the church is Padre Jose and the whiskey priest. I don't know of any other. If we don't like the church, well, we must leave it. He watched her with patience. He had more education than his wife. He could use a typewriter and knew the elements of bookkeeping. Once he had been to Mexico City, he could read a map. He knew the extent of their abandonment, the 10 hours downriver to the port, the 42 hours in the Gulf of Veracruz that was one way out. To the north the swamps and rivers petering out against the mountains which divided them from the next state. And on the other side no roads, only mule tracks and an occasional unreliable plain, Indian villages and the huts of herds, 200 miles away the Pacific. She said, I would rather die. Oh, he said, of course. That goes without saying. But we have to go on living. The old man sat on a packing case in the little dry patio. He was very fat and short of breath. He panted a little as if after great exertion in the heat. Once he had been something of an astronomer, and now he tried to pick out the 24 constellations, staring up into the night sky. He wore only a shirt and trousers. His feet were bare, but there remained something unmistakably clerical in his manner. 40 years of the priesthood had branded him. There was complete silence over the town. Everybody was asleep. The glittering worlds lay there in space like a promise. The world was not the universe. Somewhere Christ could not have died. He could not believe that to a watcher there this world could shine with such brilliance. It would roll heavily in space under its fog like a burning and abandoned ship. The whole globe was blanketed with his own sin. A woman called from the only room he possessed, Jose, Jose. He crouched like a galley slave at the sound. His eyes left the sky, and the constellations fled upwards. The beetles crawled over the patio. Jose, Jose. He thought with envy of the men who had died. It was over so soon. They were taken up there to the cemetery and shot against the wall. In 2 minutes life was extinct. And they called that martyrdom. Here life went on and on. He was only 62. He might live to 90. 28 years, that immeasurable period between his birth and his first parish. All childhood and youth and the seminary lay there. Jose. Come to bed. He shivered. He knew that he was a buffoon. An old man who married was grotesque enough, but an old priest. He stood outside himself and wondered whether he was even fit for hell. He was just a fat old impotent man, mocked and taunted between the sheets. But then he remembered the gift he had been given, which nobody could take away. That was what made him worthy of damnation, the power he still had of turning the wafer into the flesh and blood of God. He was a sacrilege. Wherever he went, whatever he did, he defiled God. Some met renegade Catholic, puffed up with the governor's politics, had once broken into a church, in the days when there were still churches, and seized the host. He had spat on it, trampled it, and then the people had got him and hanged him as they did the stuffed Judas on Holy Thursday from the belfry. He wasn't so bad a man. Padre Jose thought he would be forgiven. He was just a politician, but he himself, he was worse than that. He was 25, like an obscene picture hung here every day to corrupt children with. He belched on his packing case shaken by wind. Jose, what are you doing? You come to bed. There was never anything to do at all, no daily office, no masses, no confessions, and it was no good praying any longer at all. A prayer demanded an act and he had no intention of acting. He had lived for 2 years now in a continuous state of mortal sin with no one to hear his confession, nothing to do at all but sit and eat far too much. She fed him and fattened him and preserved him like a prize boar. Jose. He began to hiccup with nerves at the thought of facing for the 738th time his harsh housekeeper, his wife. There she would be, lying in the big shameless bed that filled up half the room, a bony shadow within the mosquito tent, a lanky jaw in a short gray pigtail and an absurd bonnet. She thought she had a position to keep up, a government pensioner, the wife of the only married priest. She was proud of it. Jose. I am he coming, my love, he said, and lifted himself from the crate. Somebody somewhere laughed. He lifted little pink eyes like those of a pig conscious of the slaughter room. A high child's voice said, Jose. He stared in a bewildered way around the patio. At a barred window opposite, 3 children watched him with deep gravity. He turned his back and took a step or 2 towards his door, moving very slowly because of his bulk. Jose, somebody squeaked again, Jose. He looked back over his shoulder and caught the faces out in expressions of wild glee. His little pink eyes showed no anger. He had no right to be angry. He moved his mouth into a ragged and baffled, disintegrated smile, and as if that sign of weakness gave them all the license they needed, they squealed back at him without disguise, Jose, Jose. Come to bed, Jose. Their little shameless voices filled the patio, and he smiled humbly and sketched small gestures for silence, and there was no respect anywhere left for him in his home, in the town, in the whole abandoned star.